Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth training session for today. My session will be covering site suitability and issues to do with irrigation. And this will be to help you to maximize your productivity through ensuring you select the best sites possible to produce macadamia and select the right production system that is going to be most appropriate for your site. So the overall objectives of today's session will be to understand where macadamia can be successfully grown in Malawi and also where it cannot be grown successfully. Understand better how productivity is linked to suitability and acts as a limit on yield and how this can be mitigated. And then having a look at some of the options you have around irrigation and an idea of the kind of costs of these type of solutions and also the impact that that will have on yield. So firstly, it's really important to understand that climate has a big impact on macadamia productivity. The three of the main things to really think about here is rainfall, so how many months the rainfall falls over, and also the overall volume. For areas which have got lower rainfall or a longer dry season, this creates more stress on the tree, and if it's too low, then you really need to think very seriously about installing irrigation. The second group of factors are to do with temperature. Macadamia trees do not like very high temperatures and they get stressed, not only through water but also through heat stress, which means that they can drop a lot of nut. So the main factors we'll look at here is maximum temperatures, so peak stress, and also the diurnal temperature, which is the difference between the daily maximum and minimum temperatures. Essentially, if it's too hot the area, it is unsuitable for macadamia, even if you have irrigation. Okay. And then the other sort of issue that is largely at play here, which is a good indicator of the overall climatic situation of the site, is altitude. At higher altitudes, you get cooler nights, so you get a bigger change of maximum and minimum temperatures during the day. The trees don't like to have very high nighttime temperatures and daytime temperatures. So areas, particularly places like close to the lake, where their night temperatures are quite high because of the lake, these are not kind of suitable. Also, generally at altitude, they've got a much longer rainy season. Now, these factors, you need to go and check them out before you start planting, because it should impact on how you decide to actually approach developing the farm, determining what water resources are needed, and really important, deciding whether this is going to be a rain-fed production system or it's going to be an irrigated production system. Some of the key climate factors to kind of consider, these are all visualizations from long-term data sets in Malawi. The first one, which is mean diurnal temperature range over the year, you can see that the lakeshore has relatively small changes in day-night temperatures. These are under 10 degrees a day. However, the higher up you go and the more continental and away from the lakeshore that you get, you start to see larger diurnal temperature ranges. This is very important for things like triggering flowering, which the environment sends a signal to the tree that it's cooling down and that it needs to go into flower. If you plant somewhere with a very low diurnal temperature range, it's likely that that signal won't be sent to the tree and you'll have much lower flowering. Also, you potentially would have fewer flushes of flowering and therefore limit the overall yield. Mean annual temperature is the second map, and that really looks at what the overall temperature is in a specific location. And we probably all are very familiar with the climate in Malawi, but this clearly kind of shows that lower Shiri Valley, the lake shore at low altitudes clearly have got much higher temperatures overall than those at higher altitude. This is largely a factor of altitude, but these areas of very high temperatures should be avoided. And these are not only like distributed equally across the year, they're disproportionately in the dry season and the hot season. We can see that the maximum temperature in the warmest month in the lower Shiri is over 34 degrees, whereas if you look in Cholo, for example, it's under 28 degrees. So that is like a 6-degree difference, even if the annual temperature change is only sort of like in range of 2 or 3 degrees. This means that these areas are particularly hot and therefore produce a lot of stress and induce a lot of stress in the trees. The max temperature, the warmest quarter, I can see that my video kind of obscures some of this, but that very much tells the same story as the previous, which is that these, if these high temperatures, if you look at the warmest quarter, which is likely to be September, October, November, something along those lines, that over that time they accumulate a lot more heat in these areas. So if we think that, okay, maybe it's only a few degrees each day, but when we multiply that by the number of days, you start to see quite big differences in these areas. So in terms of analysing this, we went to look at the suitability in terms of temperature and in terms of precipitation. The black ovals are where the industry has historically planted trees. We can see Cholo down there in the south, Nakata Bay, and then the smallholder areas in Nano and Chisi and Rumpi. Now, all these areas fit very much the temperature profile of suitability for the crop. They've got good, well-distributed rainfall, they sit at a high altitude, they're not particularly hot areas, escarpment areas, and so these are the areas that generally you saw macadamia established historically. However, the new establishments generally tend to be in areas of lower rainfall and slightly higher temperatures, and these are demarked by the white rings. And it's very common on these new establishments that they're under irrigation. There's lots of factors of why they're under irrigation. It's not just climate, it's also the fact that irrigation contributes to the establishment of the crop and enables the crop to develop more quickly, and because of that they generate revenue from the farmers more quickly, and it's a good economic rationale to install irrigation. One thing to observe from this is that there's no commercial establishments in any of these hot areas. Even if the lakeshore has got reasonable rainfall, the temperature profile really says it's unsuitable for macadamia. So here Bermarine is like the whole of the lakeshore, Karonga, Makota, Salima, going down to lakeshore areas in Mangochi. Also Shiri Valley, it's a place like Balaka, Luwande, and then lower Shiri like Chikwawa and Sanjay. These areas are just too hot, and you should definitely lean to where commercial farms have been established, because these generally are indicative of areas that are suitable. So if we assimilate all this data in terms of altitude, temperature and precipitation, we developed this suitability map. This was calibrated with, I think, 28 sites where macadamia is grown, and we have a good idea of how productive it is and what production system it is. So this is very much calibrated to what is seen in the industry. One thing that I think this sort of tells me is that really a rain-fed production system is only really suitable in these historic areas, which are highland, escarpment areas with low temperatures, good distribution of rainfall probably in excess of 1,000 millimeters almost every single year, so maybe an average of 1,100, something like that would be kind of acceptable. The trees are relatively drought tolerant, so you will still produce if you get 900 millimeters of rainfall, 950. However, the yield will be lower, and so you will take a knock-on productivity because of that. So that's very much restricted to those kind of like areas. However, there is a large area of the country which is suitable for macadamia production if supplemental irrigation can be applied. This helps to supplement natural rainfall, but then in addition to that also helps to reduce stress on the tree, helps it to hold more nut and generate higher yields. And as I said before, basically the very low lying areas under, let's say, 800 meters and close to lakeshore and in the Shire Valley are unsuitable for macadamia production. This table kind of tries to summarize that and to put some figures on it. This means that you could compare some data for your specific site. If any of you do want to know what climatic indicators are for your specific site, if you send the MVC team your lat long, this could be a drop pin on Google Maps, I would be happy to produce a short climatic report for a specific location. Okay, so we divided it into 6 classifications on suitability, ranging from unsuitable because it's too hot and dry, marginal irrigated, which means you're unlikely to get the full productivity, but you can still use irrigation and successfully grow the crop commercially, marginal rain-fed, suitable for irrigation, suitable for rain-fed, or unsuitable because it's too cold or wet. You should also realize that if you go at too higher altitude and too higher rainfalls, that means that the tree can actually grow very, very slowly indeed. Also, excessive rainfall is also a problem. Some of the older establishments were planted in very wet areas and they tend to be very large trees, which provides difficulty in terms of managing the crop. So in summary, rain-fed areas are really over 1,000 millimeters of rainfall. Irrigation should be very seriously considered in anywhere with under 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, including places with highly erratic rain. Macadamia do not like hot areas, so don't plant them in hot areas. They'll get very stressed, you'll get high mortality, and you'll get a lot of nut drops, so eventually you just won't get a commercial yield. In terms of a few pointers on irrigation and water resource development, to give you an idea of some of the benefits that irrigation can have and why it is important. And firstly, basically it radically increases the yield. If we think that estates are generally achieving maybe 2 tons of nut in shell a hectare under a rain-fed system, even with all the management and experience that they bring, irrigated farms are commonly getting 4 tons of nut in shell a hectare, and potentially even higher in good seasons, up to maybe 5 tons a hectare. This obviously is much higher levels of productivity, but as our previous speakers have spoken about, it's not just about productivity, it's also about quality. As to really generate revenue from macadamia, it needs to be high quality. Why irrigate? If we look at many of the new plantings, they're using irrigation really to mitigate this erratic rainfall, open up new areas of production which have previously been too low rainfall to really consider. Also, there's one thing which is delivering irrigation throughout the whole dry season in form of a drip or maybe a micro sprinkler setup, but also just being able to supplement water during the establishment and during immature, so like the first 4, 5, maybe 6 years, is really important to reduce mortality in the trees, get uniform establishments, and importantly speed up the establishment. Tree crops require 4, 5, 6 years, and the faster you can get it established, the better you can get it established, the faster your farm will start making money, which is, I guess, why you want to do it. It improves the nut set, so you set more nut from the flowers. It increases the ability of the tree to retain those nuts and to develop them to full maturity, so not dropping them, which then that's where the increments in yield kind of come from. So most of the systems that I've seen in Malawi kind of fall into these 4 categories. The most expensive of which is micro sprinklers, which wet about 60% of the orchard area. These type of systems are costing $3,000 or $4,000 a hectare to install. They're most suited to estates because this is where they have the largest water resources, and these systems require quite a lot of maintenance. But the design is really important to get them to work properly because they use a lot of water. But they produce the best results. Drip lines is an installation type which uses two hose pipes essentially with holes in them along the lines of the trees. These wet about 20% of the orchard. They're simpler to maintain, they require less water, but they don't wet as big an area, so the outcomes are not always as good as with a microjet system. Hose and basin again is cheaper again, but you still need to have water storage, you need to develop a water resource. It requires less pipes. It's still quite labor intensive because you've still got to pay people to come and water each tree individually. You can't really dose the trees, you've got no ability to apply nutrients at the same time, and the hose pipes and stuff can be prone to damage, so they need constant replacement. And then the most basic is kind of watering cans, where you just hire a whole pile of people to come during the dry season and to irrigate trees. One issue with that many farmers report is that they lack labour at certain points of the year. This phase of the year can coincide with land preparation, so that's the thing to be aware of. But watering cans, they deliver water, so if that's your only option, that's your only option. You could also consider starting with a more basic system and developing it as the trees develop, bearing in mind that a manual system such as watering cans or maybe even hose and basin over the first 10 years of the orchard life, that will become very labour intensive and costly. How much water is another question that we get asked very frequently. It's very important to think about how much water you actually need, so that means you can design the water resources correctly. The experts generally consider about 1200 millimeters of rainfall to be like the optimum yield can be obtained from macadamia. So you need to gauge your site against that. So if your site is at 900 millimeters, you need to replace 300 millimeters of rainfall, and vice versa. Yeah, so that kind of makes sense. So, but many factors kind of influence this. The age of the trees, because younger trees require less water than older trees, but in literature it usually suggests something around 60 litres per day in the height of summer, as the dry season and the hot season is its most intensive, so that would be your maximum per day that's needed per tree. The soil type also has a big bearing. Sandy soils, they don't hold as much water, so you have to apply more water to increase the actual uptake from the tree. It's important to realize you only replace what you need to replace. So it's not that you would deliver 60 litres of tree per tree per day. That would be based on measurements of the soil. So you could adapt how much you're applying to only give the tree as much as it needed. This is important not to overwater the trees, as that can cause problems as well, and also waste water, which is likely to be relatively scarce resource. The lower the rainfall, the more water that you need. So the more away from the optimum you are, the larger the water resource. A kind of very simple, very fast way of working this out is if you've got a 10 hectare farm which receives 950 millis of rainfall and uses drip irrigation, which is probably going to be more likely in your case than a micro sprinkler setup, I would have thought, which is why I've picked it. So if we take the 1200 millimeters of rainfall minusing the 950 millimeters that you receive, you've got a 250 millimeter shortfall to cover there. To put 1 millimeter of rainfall on a 1 hectare requires 10 cubic meters of water. So if we multiply 250 millimeters by 10 cubic meters of water, it gives you 2,500 cubic meters of water. And then the drip system irrigates only 20% of the surface area of the orchard. So that means that you multiply it by 20% because you're not watering the whole area. And so that gives you about a water demand per year at 500 cubic meters. Now obviously that's not distributed over the whole year. That would be distributed into like 4 or maybe 5 months to support the tree, supplemental irrigation from flowering to onset of rains, or to cover big gaps in rainfall during the rainy season. So that's kind of like an idea of your total need for water. Gives you an idea of potentially how much water storage you'd need and these type of issues. In terms of when, I think I mentioned it before, that for mature trees, you don't want to irrigate the whole year because the tree needs to like set into its cycle, but definitely from flowering, maybe even some pre-flowering just to like get that flowering really good, through to kind of like November, December, where the rains kind of start. This is how you maximize the yield. For immature trees, it's really important to apply supplemental irrigation at establishment and then basically the whole year apart from when it's raining. And this really helps the trees establish better. It's also important to mulch the trees as well to retain soil moisture. Some tips, if you don't over irrigate, because it can encourage vegetative growth at the expense of flowering and encourage fungal infections of the root system and can cause the tree to rapidly die. Mulches make the water go much further, retaining in the soil, so are very important. It's really important to think about the long-term implications of your decisions. So for example, boreholes eventually will need to be maintained and pumps replaced and stuff. Manual systems, you'll have to account for labor costs and material costs for that. So it's important to like think about what the long-term implications are for you, whether you're going to be at the farm every single day, whether you're going to have a system that runs largely independently because you're only going to go once or maybe twice a month. These are kind of important to understand what type of production system is going to work for you. What we see in mango as well is that people often start with manual watering, and then as the tree comes into production, they then do an investment into water towers, boreholes, and a system to distribute the water. This kind of offsets that cost, which could be appropriate. However, there are also great benefits to having the system in place right from day one. And the other important thing is to get it properly designed. Irrigation is something that does require an expert to kind of to advise you to make sure it's designed well, that it's going to work. Okay, I think that's about it. I'm happy to field any questions, and thank you very much for your attention.